Okay, so in this video, what we're going to look at is how our cells communicate within our bodies. But before we do that, let's look at why it's even important. So when we think about organisms, cells are the basic units of life. So from our single-celled prokaryotes to our multicellular organisms, cells are what make us. And so each cell, though, is specialized to perform like unique tasks. So in the human body, we are made out of 30 to 40 trillion cells with over 200 different kinds. Now, these cells, though, don't work all independently throughout our body, right? We can group our cells together based on similar functions. So when we have a group of cells that are all performing the same function or task, we call those cells a tissue. Now, for example, we can look at the pancreas. And in the pancreas, you have alpha cells and you have beta cells. And the beta cells form a tissue that will actually produce insulin. So we're going to use insulin as our example because that is a chemical messenger and one way that the cells within the pancreas can communicate with the rest of the body. So now when we look at these cells, though, they're part of the larger organ, the pancreas. And so within that pancreas, though, there are other tissue types. So the liver, the stomach are all part of the digestive system, which is an organ system. And within an organism, though, there's multiple organ systems with multiple organs made of multiple types of tissues and all different kinds of cells. So the big picture here, though, is when we have so many things going on in our body to maintain like homeostasis and just proper functioning, all of these individual cells within different tissues and different organs need to be able to communicate with each other for the overall well-being of that organism. So our focus here in the beginning of this unit is about cell communication. How do cells generate? Like, how do they make chemical signals? How do they send them? Like, how do they transmit or send chemical signals? So in that previous example, I used insulin, right? So like, how do they make insulin? Now, how do they send it throughout the body so that it can be received by their target cells? So we're going to look at like, how do chemical messages get received or chemical signals by cells? And then finally, how do our cells respond to these different chemical signals? So that is like our most basic overview. So in this video, we're going to talk about the different kinds of chemical signals that our cells can use to communicate. And we'll also look at the different mechanisms of transmitting these signals. Like what are the options for how they get to where they're going? And then in future videos, we're going to look at how cells receive the signals, as well as what happens when we say, oh, it received a signal, but what is the cell response? Like, how does the cell respond to that signal? So 3 and 4, I feel like are going to be the more detailed videos. So right now, let's go ahead and in this one, focus on steps 1 and 2. So when we think about generating or making signals, let's revisit cells and the different organelles, right? And we want to think about like which of the organelles make things. Because if a cell is going to generate or make chemical signals, it has to use an organelle to do that. So when we think about the organelles that actually produce stuff, one of those, we have proteins and we have ribosomes. Ribosomes make proteins. So some of our chemical signals are actually protein-based. And then the other organelle that produces stuff is our smooth ER. Our smooth ER makes lipids. So our 2 main categories of chemical signals are proteins and lipids. So they're going to be protein-based chemical signals or lipid-based chemical signals. So when we compare and contrast these two, let's think about the lipid-based chemical signals and tie this back into Unit 2 in AP Bio. So here, a lipid, if you remember, is nonpolar. And so like non-soluble in water. It does not mix with water. So these non-polar chemical signals can actually go right through the cell membrane because of that nonpolar center. So examples of chemical signals that we will see are lipid based are going to be our steroid hormones like testosterone or estrogen or progesterone. So here, let's go ahead and look at testosterone. So this is a sterol. If you remember lipids have three categories. You have triglycerides, you have phospholipids, and you have sterols. So here, testosterone was actually created from cholesterol. So cholesterol was the precursor or the building block to build testosterone. So here, testosterone is lipid based. So when a cell, when a gland sends out the hormone testosterone, when testosterone reaches a target cell, it can actually cross right through that lipid bilayer because the testosterone molecule is also a lipid and nonpolar. Now, on the opposite, though, we have our protein-based chemical signals. And so these are polar or water-soluble. They cannot cross that cell membrane. So we want to think to ourselves, if a cell is receiving a message, or first off, let me continue with the chart. So examples would be any chemical signals that are protein-based. So they can be like hormones that are derived from amino acids or polypeptides. And so at some point in that chemical signal, they're based in a protein. So now an example of this would be epinephrine, which is like a modified amino acid. So epinephrine here cannot cross that membrane. So how does it communicate with its target cell, right? If it can't get through the cell membrane. So this is where we rely on membrane proteins. So there are receptors for these chemical signals. So in this case here, we have a transmembrane receptor protein. So it spans the entire membrane and will actually be what receives that ligand or chemical signal. So when I mentioned steps 3 and 4, like how do cells receive signals, this will be the focus of the next video. All right, so here though, we've talked about the different kinds of chemical signals. We have lipid-based and we have protein-based, and that their chemical properties will determine how they interact with their target cells. So if they are a lipid-based chemical signal or hormone that will cross right through the membrane and their receptor will be inside. So they will have a protein as well to receive it, but it'll be inside the cell. If it's a protein-based chemical signal, its receptor is located within the cell membrane. Okay, so now let's go ahead and look at the second part to this, which is different mechanisms of transmitting the signals. So as we go through the remainder of this video, we're going to look at 3 different ways that the signals can be sent from one cell to its target cell. So when I say target cell, that's like the destination. That's where the chemical signal is trying to reach. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the 3 different ways that cells communicate. So we have direct cell-to-cell contact. Now we see this in plant cells with plasmodesmata, and in animal cells we have gap junctions and white blood cells. And then the second way is over short distances with chemical signals. So that is like 2 neurons, or in your immune system, or some white blood cells, or even quorum sensing, which I don't have quorum sensing listed here, but that's another short distance communication. And then for long distance, throughout the entire body, we have our endocrine system, which is going to use our hormones to send those signals. So what I have in the next section of this video is we're going to look at examples of direct cell-to-cell contact, and then we'll move into each of these. So first, let's go ahead and talk about plasmodesmata in plant cells. So here we have a plant cell, a bunch of plant cells, and we have cell walls around these plant cells. But if we zoom into these little tiny gaps that you see, these little tiny channels within the cell walls, we call these plasmodesmata. And so if I zoom into 2 cells, I can see here cytoplasm 1, cytoplasm 2. In between, now it's not really like a tube like I have shown here, but I just wanted to emphasize that they're little channels that connect cytoplasms of two plant cells. And what can happen are molecules like ions, for example, can pass from cell 1 through the plasmodesmatas into cell 2. So that is one example in plants of how their cytoplasms can be connected through plasmodesmata, so molecules and signals can flow from one cytoplasm to the next. So so molecules can pass directly from one cell to the next. Now in humans, we don't have this very often, or in animal cells, but one place that is kind of important is we have, ours are not called plasmodesmata, but instead we have these things called gap junctions. Let's take the lining of our intestines, for example. So one of my passions in life is like overall health and nutrition and well-being. And one of the key factors to like maximum health would be a very healthy lining of your small intestine. That the tissue that forms the lining of your small intestine, so a bunch of cells all performing similar functions, are very close together. So we have these tight junctions, in yellow here, that hold our cells together to form a barrier or a wall, protecting our body from the food and the particles passing through our intestines. So here we have these cells really close together. And if we look at, like, here's that tight junction, kind of like holding them together, but we also have some gap junctions. And the gap junctions are very similar to plasmodesmata. Like that's where the cytoplasm is connected, and then molecules can flow from one cell to the next. Now, this is not in all animal cells, but one location is in the cells that line the small intestine. But that would be direct contact from one cell to the next. Now, our next thing we're going to look at, though, is in the immune system. Now, the immune system, you don't have to memorize the immune system. It's more of an illustrative example. But if you do want more detailed in the immune system, I do have a whole video on both like specific and non-specific defenses. So anyway, this right here is a white blood cell. This is a macrophage, and a white blood cell's job in our body is to engulf and like take in by endocytosis pathogens that are circulating within us. So here, this white blood cell takes in a bacteria or a virus or something, engulfs a pathogen, and will destroy it. And it's going to call for help, though. It's going to alert another aspect of our immune system that, hey, I found this foreign like particle, this foreign invader inside of our body, and we need to activate other parts of our immune system. So here we're going to see an example of direct cell-to-cell contact. So this macrophage, that little blue thing you see, is a protein carrying a piece of that pathogen, of that like bacteria or something, to its surface. Now it's going to alert a major helper in our immune system called helper T cells. So here, this is direct cell-to-cell contact, that when that helper T cell, that orange thing is actually a protein. So you have two proteins touching and communicating. So this like bonding or this attaching together of these two proteins will actually activate that helper T cell. So now once that helper T cell is activated, it can go and help other parts of the immune system. So, for example, let's go ahead and look at how that helper T cell communicates with other parts of the immune system, and some more examples of cell-to-cell contact. So here, let's pretend that a cell gets infected with a virus. Maybe it's chickenpox. Okay, so as a kid, I did have chickenpox, and that virus gets inside of your host cells, and viruses are not living things, so they replicate inside of your cells and they multiply inside. But how do your immune system, cells flowing by, even know this, right? So inside, when you have a virus replicating inside one of your cells, we have other proteins, these are MHC molecules, that will actually take a piece of that virus and present it on the surface of the cell, of that virus-infected cell. So basically, any immune cells traveling by can be like, oh, hey, that is like, it's like a white flag, like waving, like, uh-oh, hey, look, I have something infecting me. So now we have another type of immune cell called a killer T cell, a cytotoxic T cell. And again, we see this direct cell-to-cell communication. So now, remember that helper T cell, though, that was activated? So here, okay, this is kind of more complicated than we need to know for just examples. So again, I have whole videos you can watch in detail of how this works. But basically, an activated helper T cell is going to send out chemical signals, these little red things, called cytokines. But I want you to notice those chemical signals, these two cells are communicating. The helper T cell is sending signals to the cytotoxic T cell, but they're not directly touching. So here, this is an example of a short distance communication, cells sending chemical signals to cells nearby, adjacent cells, or cells within the vicinity. So when you use little chemical signals that are just traveling a short distance, we call these local regulators. So earlier, I was calling like insulin a hormone. These little red cytokines I would not call a hormone because they're only traveling a short distance. Hormones technically will travel in your bloodstream. We are not traveling in the bloodstream here. So here we have the local regulators. Okay, and now those local regulators will like activate that purple or the dark purple cytotoxic T cell, which will then, its cell response is to release proteins that will actually put holes in the virus-infected cell membrane, which will basically lead to cell lysis and the death of that cell. So that virus-infected cell will actually like undergo cell lysis, which here's a picture where it just, the cytoplasm leaks out, the cell dies, and the macrophages will come and clean it up. Okay, so now those are some examples of direct cell-to-cell contact for cell communication. Now let's go ahead and look at local regulators, a few more examples. So as I mentioned, these are not hormones. Okay, so in our skin, our immune system is another example of local regulators. So here, when we talk about, like, let's say your skin gets damaged. In our skin or in our blood vessels, we have white blood cells and red blood cells flowing in our blood vessels, okay? So let's say you get poked by a tack. Now, and the skin is damaged. So these damaged cells, we have some right below the surface of our skin called mast cells. They're going to send out chemical signals, so local regulators called histamine. And so this histamine's target cells are the walls of the blood vessels. Now, in response, the capillaries will become more dilated. This is why you get red around the edges of a cut or something, because the blood vessels are expanding. So that was the cell response. Now, the walls of the blood vessels, though, in response, it kind of swells a little bit, are going to release their own chemical signals called chemokines. So now the tissue that forms the wall of the capillary will release chemical signals into that damaged tissue. And that those chemical signals, okay, I want to point out that when that tack or when your skin got cut, chances are it wasn't sterile and it had bacteria or pathogens on the surface. And then you also have bacteria that live on the surface of your skin. So when your skin got damaged, bacteria did enter into your tissues. So now those chemokines, though, attract our phagocytic cells, our white blood cells, whose job is to engulf and like clean up those bacteria. So now those purple triangles, those local regulators attracted white blood cells. And then you have like, it's on a timer, I think. Oh, here we go. It also will attract blood clotting factors, as little dark red circles are what form your scabs. So those will be attracted to the opening in the tissue, and that'll form a scab so no more bacteria can get in. And then it like cleans up, it heals, and everything goes back to normal like that. Okay, so here is another example of local regulators. So if you have two neurons, these are like our nerve cells, And again, I have a whole video in more detail if you want to know how the nervous system actually works. But really, our question is, how do these two cells communicate? So this gap or this space between two neurons is called a synapse. And so what happens here, right? So the cell before the synapse is called the presynaptic cell. And the cell after the synapse is called the postsynaptic cell. So when we look at how they communicate, at the end of the presynaptic cell, there are these chemicals, protein-based chemicals called neurotransmitters. These are the ligands. These are the signals that the neurons will use to communicate with the next cell. So they are stored in little vesicles at the end of the neuron. So when that neuron receives a signal that it needs to communicate, which again, this calcium flowing in and the charges is a whole nother video that we're not really concerned about right now. But basically, there'll be calcium will trigger the release of these neurotransmitters, of these chemical signals into the synapse. So you can see them moving. This is exocytosis. These ligands or these chemical signals, these neurotransmitters, are going to be released by exocytosis into that synapse. So that space between the two cells. Now, when a cell receives a chemical signal, though, it relies on proteins. So on that postsynaptic cell, there's protein receptors. So these chemicals are going to travel across a very short distance. So these neurotransmitters are ligands, and they're going to cause those protein channels to open, and then sodium will rush inside, and then you'll have the message continue in the post cell. But really, all we're focusing on here are those little pink neurotransmitters traveling a short distance as a local regulator to communicate between those two cells. All right. And then our next example is, what about in bacteria, though, right? How do bacteria communicate? So bacteria live in colonies. They live in groups, but their own one cell is a single bacterium. They don't have cells nearby. They're not multicellular. So they use what's called quorum sensing. And a quorum this is a definition from Google, where it's an assembly or society that must be present at any of its meetings, or a minimum number that must be present to make the meeting conclusions valid. You have to have a certain amount in order for something to say, oh yeah, it was a large enough amount to say yes or no or whatever. So in quorum sensing, if you have one bacterium send out a chemical signal, nothing's really going to happen. But if you have multiple bacteria, let's think about it. If you are a single bacterium by yourself and you receive a signal, that tells you, oh, I'm not alone, right? So depending on how many signals you receive as that bacterium will tell you information about the population density. So here, as the bacteria receive different signals, basically once they reach a certain threshold or a certain amount of chemical signals, they all work as a group to activate gene expression together. And then they bring about their cell responses at the same time to have a larger impact. So I do, again, have a whole video on just quorum sensing that you're welcome to watch. Okay, so, and then our last way that cells can communicate is over long distances through traveling through the bloodstream. So this is where we're going to use hormones as part of our endocrine system. So here we are on our last slide, okay? So now when we look at this, our endocrine system relies on glands. Now glands are organs that are going to release hormones. So a gland releases hormones into the bloodstream, and they're traveling in the blood. You can think of the circulatory system as kind of like the freeway or the transport, the highway, the roads of how a hormone will get from a gland to their target cells. So here, hormones can be protein-based or lipid-based, like we talked about at the beginning. So here we have a lipid-based hormone and a protein-based hormone, and they travel through the bloodstream to reach their target cells. But when we talk about these chemical signals, these hormones that are being sent out, they need to be received. So if you think about like baseball, for example, if the pitcher throws the ball, you can think of the ball as the hormone, and then the catcher's mitt, the glove, is the receptor. Like you have to receive that message somehow. So here, you need a protein receptor. So when we look at protein receptors, you're going to find them on the target cells. So when you look at a lipid hormone and a protein-based hormone, though, the receptors are located in different places on those target cells. So let's look at lipids first. So when a lipid-based hormone is released from a gland and it travels throughout the body's bloodstream and it reaches its target cell, because it's lipid-based, it can travel right through that cell membrane and attach to the protein receptor within the cell. Now, if it's a protein-based hormone released from a gland, it'll travel through the bloodstream, but instead, its protein receptor is located on the surface of the target cell. It's in that cell membrane. It doesn't actually, the hormone does not cross through. Okay, so that is the basics of the endocrine system. So when we look at where we're going with this cell communication unit, we just looked at the different types of chemical signals. We have lipid-based and we have protein-based. Then we looked at the different mechanisms of transmitting those signals. So you have direct cell-to-cell contact. You have local regulators. They don't travel in the bloodstream. They travel a very short distance to nearby cells. And then we have our long distance that relies on our endocrine system using hormones to travel in the bloodstream to their target cells. Now, in my next video, we're going to look at how do the cells receive those chemical signals. This is where we're going to focus more on those protein receptors. And then we'll talk about what happens within the cell when those receptors are activated. And then we'll see different examples of cell responses. Like, what are some examples of cells communicating? And that is our cell communication unit. So good job, my wonderful students.